There it goes.
So,
Welcome to the undergraduate competition number 2 on Thursday of the Minnesota GIS conference. Welcome to the panelists and the students, and we are excited to hear the presentations. First up, we have Emilia Holstine, right? And
Holstine.
Hi.
Hi. Holstine. Sorry,
okay.
it's a weird name.
Let me announce just one thing. It's from the setter. While in presentation, except for the presenter, please turn off your video and mute your voice. Sometimes we have lags, so I think it's better for only presenter having the video. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt your first.
Holstine. Okay. Yeah, I'll keep on going with the introduction, and I will remember to turn off my video afterwards. Okay. Currently a student at the University of Minnesota Duluth, working on obtaining her bachelor's degree in anthropology with a minor in GIS. She is interested in the intersections between culture, history, and environment. She finds maps as a visual representation of data to be particularly revealing when looking at human patterns, and hopes to utilize maps as a public education tool. When not working on homework, she can be found out with her camera looking for things to photograph, hopefully with field maps, right? And welcome, Emilia.
Thank you.
Before we start, just one more announcement. So the presenter has the 20 minute, so 15-minute presentation and 5 minutes for question. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll keep an eye on that clock. All right, so I'm going to start a screen share. So my name is Emilia Holstine. I'm at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and I'm doing a presentation on Manoomin waters at risk, water bodies and wild rice locations threatened by Pipeline 3. As a clarification to begin, Manoomin is the local Anishinaabe word for wild rice, and I will be using the word Manoomin throughout my presentation. So as an introduction, if you've listened to the news at all lately, you've probably heard about Pipeline 3. It was built by the Enbridge Oil Company. It's replacing the old Pipeline 3, and it cuts across northern Minnesota, bringing tar sands to be refined into oil from Alberta, Canada to Superior, Wisconsin. Construction on it was just completed in September of 2021. And there have been and continue to be extensive protests against Line 3 by both environmental activists and Indigenous rights activists. So as a bit of legal background for why there's protests against the pipeline, the treaties of 1837 and 1854 with the US government and the local Anishinaabe tribes establish Manoomin harvesting rights for the local tribes, and the US government essentially promised that even in ceded territory that they gave up to the federal government, they would be allowed to continue harvesting Manoomin freely and without hindrance. And later legislation did clarify that that includes the right to a healthy and environmentally sound Manoomin harvest. And Manoomin isn't just a food staple for the Anishinaabe. It's incredibly culturally significant, and a lot of Anishinaabe view it as a key element of their cultural and spiritual identity. And Enbridge has a bit of a history. During construction this past September, they did not follow all of their permits. They dug deeper than they were supposed to, and they damaged an aquifer that ended up spilling 24 million gallons of groundwater, and then failed to report the spill to the DNR. The DNR did eventually find out and gave them 30 days to rectify the situation, and they did not fix it within those 30 days. The previous Pipeline 3, which is also leaking, did at one point back in 1991 create the largest inland oil spill in US history in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. And the only reason that oil spill didn't contaminate the Mississippi River is because it happened to be a particularly cold February, and they were able to squeegee the oil off of the surrounding water bodies that were frozen over before it reached the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, we can't count on that, and the current Pipeline 3 does cross the Mississippi River at 2 separate locations. So when I was looking at how to evaluate risk to local water bodies, I first needed to create find a shapefile of Pipeline 3 to use for my analysis. I couldn't find a publicly available shapefile of Pipeline 3, so I found the publicly available plans for the pipeline. I then georeferenced those images onto a map of Minnesota counties and townships, and then traced a polyline over that image to create my own shapefile for Pipeline 3. I then had to determine how big of a watershed I would use. So for those unfamiliar, watershed is the distance water travels within an area and how water travels from one area to the next. And pollutants often get carried along watershed boundaries. I did some extensive research, and unfortunately, there's no good way to determine how far a specific amount of oil will spread. There's just too many factors involved to give a solid number for X amount of oil will produce X amount or will travel X distance. So I decided to create a tiered watershed system. I started with matching my watersheds to the DNR watershed shapefile. So you can see where this, my watershed is, and then I tried to match mine as closely as I could to the DNR watershed. I then used the next smallest interval of watershed provided by the DNR, and then created 3 more layers in between those 2 layers of watersheds. I then ranked each one based on its size. So every single watershed that directly passed through the pipeline route and is the smallest level got labeled as a risk level 1. The next size up of watershed that passed directly through the pipeline got labeled as level 2, and so on and so forth, with the 5th level being at least risk, but is still potentially at risk in case of a particularly large oil spill. I then combined those layers into one shapefile, and then had to locate bodies of water within those watersheds. So I used the DNR shapefiles for water features and for Manoomin locations, and selected those that fell within the boundaries of those watersheds. Also assigned each of those water features a risk level based on where it fell within the watershed, or which watershed it fell within. Altogether, I created one large map displaying all of the areas at risk. I also I calculated the total surface area of water that would potentially be at risk, and found that 442,221 acres of Manoomin waters are potentially at risk, which comes out to 28.3% of all Manoomin water in Minnesota as being at risk from Pipeline 3 contaminants. I wanted to create a smaller map as well, or a more large-scale map that showed details more clearly. And so I created a map series based on watersheds. I named them from the large DNR watershed shapefiles. I haven't included the whole series in my slide because there's about 16 of them, but you can see how I went a little bit closer, and it could provide more precise ideas of what areas are at risk. I also created a web map, which I'll get into in just a moment, but part of why I wanted to create this map was I really wanted to visualize the amount of area that was at risk from the pipeline and potentially in violation of treaty rights. And I also wanted this to be publicly available data that individuals could look up if they were curious or concerned. I know lots of people who have personal ties to areas in that region, such as they have a family cabin on a lake there, or for whatever other reason, they might care about that area. So I wanted people, sorry, my web map's not loading right now. There we go. I created a web map, which in retrospect, I would probably use a different web map apping platform. But I wanted people to be able to look up, say, they care about Leech Lake. And so I wanted them to be able to look up Leech Lake and see, oh, maybe my family cabin is at risk because it's at a level 5 tiered watershed, or maybe theirs is closer. Just so that people could get a visual idea of places they might personally care about.
Hey, Emilia.
And yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing your map.
Oh.
I think you're sharing just the PowerPoint presentation.
All right. Let's see if I can fix that real quick.
Thank you.
You probably have to stop sharing and reshare.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
You can tell I don't use Zoom often. There we go. Can you see it now?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Again, my web map is loading. And, so this would, again, be a publicly available map that people could use to, say, look up a specific location that they were concerned about and view what might be at risk. So the reason I personally got invested in this is because I do also study anthropology at UMD. I became involved with local Indigenous rights and specifically issues surrounding food sovereignty and how important food sovereignty is to establishing Native self-reliance, and wild rice is a huge part of that for many of them. I also personally care about this because I have a family cabin that's in an area that's kind of at risk, and I wanted to know what the chances were of my family cabin being uninhabitable because of Pipeline 3. It is not terribly at risk, but it does still fall within a level 5 watershed. So unfortunately, it is still there, but I just really cared about this on a personal level. And I just hope other people will too. Thank you.
So Emily, are you done?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, so then we will take a question.
I can ask a question.
Yes.
So you created those watershed boundaries, or you just use
Yes.
it in a, yeah.
So their ArcGIS Pro has a watershed tool.
Mm-hmm.
It involves a number of steps, and you start with a DEM raster file, and I did lots of trial and error to create watersheds that matched the DNR shape files as closely as possible. And some of my I wanted to create smaller tiers than were available through the DNR. So that's why I did used the DNR's smallest, or one of their smaller ones and then one of their bigger ones, and then created tiers in between that.
So why don't you just use the DNR watersheds directly?
So I actually did this project for class GIS 2. And part of the assignment was to use skills we'd learned in that class. And one of the things we'd learned in that class was about how to delineate watersheds.
Yeah.
And if I did it again, I'd probably use the DNR shape files for the largest and smallest ones, and then still come up with my own mid-range watersheds and just integrate those better.
So you used the 30-meter DEM, or what's the resolution of the DEM?
It was the 30-meter DEM. I tried the 10-meter DEM, but it was too detailed for the scale I was going for with the entire state of Minnesota.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yes, hi, Emily, good job. I'm just wondering, what tools did you use in order to create your sub-watersheds from the 30-meter DEM?
So I first used the what I think it was the fill function first. I have it written down, but it was the flow direction and then the flow accumulation tool. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. It was the flow direction and the flow accumulation tool. And I then used the delineate watershed tool. No, it was the con tool and then the stream tool. And then from there you use the watershed tool.
Have to use a threshold, right? So what's the threshold that you use? Did you use
Which what?
A threshold to delineate the boundary? Have you used any of the value? So for the size, you know.
I don't believe so. It was the watershed tool was the one that after it created the streams, then it delineates the boundaries with the watershed tool.
Yeah, to create the stream, you need to provide a threshold. So otherwise, you know, the threshold will determine how much detail of the stream you will extract. So, but that's
I believe I used the con tool for that. There's a tool called condition.
What's the intervals of the contour?
I have it written down. It will be just a moment to pull that up. The final intervals I used for the con tool were, if my final intervals I used were there we go. 2,000, 5,000, 100,000, 1 million, and 1,500,000.
Okay.
Hey, Emilia,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, is there time? I'll sneak one in. Thanks for your presentation. I enjoyed the maps. They're beautifully done. Enjoyed the cartography on that and
Thank you.
with that. And so you're focused primarily on surface water pollution, right? Did you look at groundwater at all, or
I didn't. That was, I know it's another aspect of it, but to be entirely honest, I didn't have the tools or know-how to look at groundwater. This ended up being a much bigger project than I originally intended, even with what I did. So I did the best I could with what I knew how to do, because this was only my second ever GIS course that I was doing this map for. So it took a lot of trial and error, just figuring out what I did have. And groundwater would be something I would like to consider if I would redo this project.
Yep, fair enough. It's a lot of work. And one of the goals was for education, to be able to share this information with the public and with people. Have you shared it with people? Have you gotten any reactions to the online map?
I have. I've haven't been able to share it as widely as I would like. Mostly I've shared it with people I personally know who tend to have a similar opinion to me on the pipeline, but they have really enjoyed or liked looking at it. I've seen lots of people go, wait, now wait, I want to see what how close this lake is to the pipeline. Oh wait, now I want to see where this is in relation to the pipeline. And I would, if possible, like to get it more publicly available or more widely distributed.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So any other questions?
I have one comment. I think the topic is very interesting, and
Okay, sure.
meaningful. So, and it's a great way to, share the result with the online community using the web app. So, I like the topic.
Thank you.
Mhm.
You made a comment though in your presentation about the web map that you made, that you wouldn't make it the same way. Did I mishear that?
Yeah,
What would you do different?
I would probably use a different web mapping application. I used ArcGIS Experience Builder, and it has the basic tools I like, but it takes so long for it to load that people would just kind of lose interest, if that makes sense. And I would like one with that was easier to edit or had more ability to specialize the features and make it easier to turn layers on and off so that people could clarify what they're looking at, get a better view of what they're looking at, and just design it better in general to make it more user friendly, especially for an inexperienced user.
Yeah, some widgets in there, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, drop down menus.
Okay, baby, because we have enough time, so let me ask you the technical question, because I'm teaching that watershed analysis part of my intermediate GIS. So do you know like what was your flow accumulation threshold? Because that is a part of the like watershed analysis.
Yes,
And
I
then
wrote it down.
if so, like what was the reason why you set up that threshold?
So I guess you asked what the con tool was, and I realized the numbers I gave you were for my threshold and not the con tool, and I'm not sure.
No, it's not the con tool, like a flow accumulation threshold.
I basically a lot of trial and error. I ended up first making a threshold that was way too low, and I thought I ran the program wrong, but it was just so small that it wouldn't render. And just basically a lot of trial and error until and redoing all of the steps over and over again until I found ones that I figured if my watersheds matched the DNR ones fairly closely, then I probably got it about right. So just a lot of trial and error trying to make those match up as closely as possible.
Yep, makes sense. And then it was very good. I mean, the map. I really enjoyed that cartography.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we need to go for the second presenter, Ethan Smith. So Michael, please introduce him.
All right. Well done, Emilia. We're going to look forward now to Ethan's talk. Ethan Smith is a senior at Minnesota State University, Mankato. He will be graduating in the spring of 2022 with a Bachelor of Science in Geography and a certificate in GIS. He is interested in geospatial intelligence and crime analysis. Upon graduation from Minnesota State University, Mankato, Ethan is planning on attending graduate school. Welcome, Ethan.
Thank you. So, okay, so like you mentioned, I'm Ethan Smith. I'm a senior at Minnesota State University, Mankato. And the topic of my presentation will be spatiotemporal analysis of crime around light rail transit platforms in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So first, I'm going to talk about the reasons behind my analysis, then my objective of my analysis, my study area and data, the methods that I used, final observations, and then we'll finish up with some questions. So the reason behind my analysis is that I ride the light rail transit platform or light rail transit to attend Twins games. I would also routinely hear on the news about crime being on the rise on the Minneapolis light rail transit system. So my idea, the study came from watching the news and as well as reading news articles. Also, I'm just interested in crime analysis. So overall, all of these reasons are what made me interested in being able to determine which platforms are in the area of frequent crime. So after seeing where crimes were happening a lot on the Minneapolis light rail system, I wanted to learn a little bit more about the types of crimes. So I learned that the FBI uses a reporting system known as the Uniform Crime Reporting, which most police departments around the country report the number of crimes, part 1 and part 2 crimes back to the FBI, which will allow them to determine how much crime is rising in the US. The type of crime classifications that they use are part 1 crimes and part 2 crimes, which part 1 is going to be the most severe, and it'll consist of crimes like aggravated robbery, criminal homicide, motor vehicle theft, and robbery. And then part 2 crimes will consist of, or are going to be less severe, and they're going to consist of simple assault, stolen property, vandalism, disorderly conduct, and things like that. And then the type of crimes that I'm going to discuss are going to be robbery of person, which is the act of forcibly taking someone's possessions. So aggravated robbery will refer to the causing of bodily harm, causing fear, and or possession of a dangerous weapon of any kind while in the act. And then theft is taking someone else's property with no plan of returning it, which theft in the charge that we'll see here in a little bit refers to other theft, which indicates something being taken without it being in the possession of someone. Theft from motor vehicle is taking someone else's property from their vehicle. Then auto theft is the attempted or the theft or attempted theft of a motor vehicle. And then the theft of person is taking something that was in the possession of someone. So the objective of my analysis was to identify the type of crimes that most frequently occurred around the Minneapolis light rail transit platforms, as well as locate where the most frequent crimes were occurring at and their intensity. Identify where the crime hotspots were at and if they encompass the light rail transit platforms. And I also wanted to identify the time of day and months of the year when crimes happen most frequently. So my study area consists of the light rail system platforms that were inside Minneapolis. The light rail lines that I focused on were the green and blue lines. I focused on these lines because they are the 2 lines that are currently present in Minneapolis. The other part of the system is the Minneapolis public bus system that connects people to these light rail routes, but these were not included in my study. Another reason that I focused on these lines is that these lines will see around 30,000 people daily, and it can be even more than that during events such as Vikings and Twins games. The data for my analysis came from the Minnesota Geospatial Commons and Open Data Minneapolis. All my data was projected to NAD 1983 and then UTM Zone 15 North. The data consisted of that I gathered from those websites were from Minneapolis crime data points for the years 2010, 15, and 17. I also gathered the light rail transit platforms, light rail networks, road networks, and then the Minneapolis city boundary. Then all this data was then clipped to the city of Minneapolis boundary. The reason why the years 2010, 15, and 17 were used was due to the change in how the crimes were reported after the year 2017. So some of the methods that I used were buffers to develop my study sites, a frequency tool to identify the most frequent crimes in the tables, kernel density to show the intensity of where the 5 most frequent crimes were at, the average nearest neighbor, analysis to look for the clustering of data points, hotspot analysis to identify if any platforms were in crime hot or were in hotspots, data clocks to identify trends in time, and then I also performed a service area assessment to show response time from each Minneapolis precinct. So in order to check the frequency of the crimes that were within the 500-foot buffers of the platforms, I first did a select by location and selected the crime data points that were within the 500-foot buffers. And then I exported those selected features. I then used the new exported data layer to check the frequency of the crimes that were frequently occurring within 500 feet. In order to do this, I used the frequency tool in ArcGIS Pro, and then I also made these graphs in ArcGIS Pro. Then when looking at the graphs, you'll see at the top 5 crimes that occur throughout the years are theft from motor vehicle, robbery of person, theft of person, and an aggravated robbery. The only year that aggravated robbery was in the top 5 crimes was 2010, which was switched with auto thefts. So this chart's going to be based off of the frequency of those crimes for the years. So for 2010, within 500 feet of the platforms, there were 405 thefts, 144 thefts from motor vehicles, 55 robbery of person, 52 theft of person, and 38 auto thefts. On the platform with the highest theft occurred at was warehouse district. The platform with the highest theft of person occurred at was also again the warehouse district. And the platform with the highest robbery of person occurred at was the warehouse district, Nicollet Mall, and Franklin Ave. And the platform with the highest theft for motor vehicle occurred at was the warehouse district, Nicollet Mall, Government Plaza, US Bank Stadium, West Bank, and Stadium Village. The platform with the highest auto thefts occurred at were the warehouse district, Nicollet Ave, Government Plaza, West Bank, Cedar Riverside, Franklin Ave, Stadium Village, and Prospect Park. Then going on to for 2015, so within 500 feet of the platforms, there were 496 thefts, 104 thefts of person, 97 thefts of motor vehicles, 78 robbery of person, and 47 aggravated robberies. So the platform with the highest theft was again the warehouse district, and as well as the highest theft of person was again at the warehouse district as well, which this is what these maps are showing, the intensity of these crimes. And then the platform with the highest theft of motor vehicle for the warehouse district, Nicollet Mall, and Government Plaza. And the platform with the highest robbery of person for the warehouse district, Nicollet Mall, and Government Plaza. And the platforms with the highest aggravated robbery for the warehouse district and Nicollet Mall. And then for 2017, within 500 feet of the platforms, there were 489 thefts, 138 thefts for motor vehicles, 67 robbery of person, 65 thefts of person, and 53 aggravated robberies. The platform with the highest theft were the warehouse district and Nicollet Mall. The platform with the highest theft of motor vehicle was West Bank, warehouse district, Nicollet Mall, Government Plaza, and Stadium Village. And also the platform with the highest robbery of person was the warehouse district and Nicollet Mall. And the platforms with the highest theft from person was the warehouse district. And then the platforms with the highest aggravated robberies were warehouse district and Nicollet Mall. I then ran an average nearest neighbor analysis on all my crime data points for the whole city of Minneapolis, which the results of the average nearest neighbor analysis indicated that there was some obvious clustering occurring throughout the data points. And upon running the average nearest neighbor, I then ran an optimized hotspot analysis on the crime data points, which the results indicated that hotspots surrounded a large portion of the platforms in the downtown area of Minneapolis and the platforms leading into the downtown area of Minneapolis. The platforms that consistently showed up in the mall or inside the hotspots were Target Field, Warehouse District, Nicollet Mall, Government Plaza, US Bank Stadium, Cedar Riverside Plaza, Franklin Ave, and Lake Street, which these are the shown in the location. These maps are showing the locations of the platforms and the hotspots of the crime. I then use these data clocks, which they show when crimes are occurring throughout the day and months of the year. From my observation of the data clocks associated with the days and months of the year that crime occurs within 500 platforms, you can tell that there are a lot more days There are a lot more days during like the winter months that'll have 0 or close to 0 crimes. A popular day for an increase in crime is Halloween. And summer and fall seems to have a lot more days that consist of 6+ crimes and an upward of 11+ crimes within 500 feet of light rail platforms. And then this other set of data clocks show the time of day and the month that crime occur throughout the year. The time crimes occur the most is between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m., with 1 a.m. being the most dominant time crime occurs, and 2 a.m. being associated with bar closing time in Minneapolis city limits, which I'll discuss a little bit more on this later in the presentation. I also wanted to look at the population demographics of Minneapolis in relation to the light rail platforms. From my observation, the median age of the census tracts that were in the area of crime hotspots and near the platforms did not have an influence on the crime. The age group by the platforms and the hotspots changed too much for a certain age group to be the result of the crime near platforms. Which also another observation that I looked at was the high crime isn't race related. There isn't solid enough evidence that more crime is occurring in a certain demographic dominated area because the platforms are in diverse areas and also areas of different races are in the crime hotspots. For example, downtown is dominated by both whites and African Americans. I also used a network analysis to perform a service area assessment in order to see how fast can the police respond to a certain designated time. I want to see if the area of the platforms were out of range for the average police response time, which could have been causing the higher crime. The time I set were 1 minute, 1 to 3 minutes, and 3 to 10 minutes. The reason for 10 minutes is because according to the FBI, that's the average response time for police. Almost no part of the Minneapolis city limits is outside the national average of those 10 minutes. And therefore, it's a good inference that the cause for more crime being reported is due to a heavier police presence, which this map is just giving an example of the service or the response times from one of the police precincts in the northern part of Minneapolis. So my final observations. So in conclusion, the most likely platform that you will become a victim of robbery or theft of any kind will be the Warehouse District platform and Nicollet Mall platform. My observation with these two platforms having consistent thefts and robberies is associated with time and data clocks. These areas are home to restaurants and bars, and after 2 a.m., bars cannot serve alcohol in the city of Minneapolis. So people that are impaired and it being dark out makes these people a lot more susceptible to robbery and theft. And the platforms that experience motor vehicle theft of any kind are the platforms that are within 500 feet from parking lots, parking garages, and apartment complexes. Although it should be noted that some of these parking lots are part of the light rail system for commuters to park and ride, so they are of value to the study. And then here are some of the references that I used. And then, any questions?
Thank you, Ethan. So we'll take questions. Oh, and then Michael,
Yes.
can you go to the participant, that icon, and then click to the what's called the audience attendees?
Yeah.
And then allow the Tom as the panelist. The Tom is the one of our judges.
Certainly.
So he's in the audience. So.
Throw a question to Ethan. Thanks for your talk. Why 500 feet? Why'd you choose that number for the buffer?
When I first started, I actually had it set to 100, but the study area wasn't really big enough. So I wanted to make sure I could include both sides of the platforms, like both the sidewalks on both sides of it. So that was the reason why I increased the size of it. Okay.
And you found that worked well?
Yeah.
Did you try any other, in between 100 and 500 or?
Not really. I started with 100 and then I just increased it to 500, which I felt was the best option to use.
Yep. How clean or how good was the crime data? Did you find that easy to work with or?
Yeah, it was actually, I didn't really have any issue with it because it comes straight from the open data Minneapolis, which is reported by them. So I was just able to just export it and use that as my data. So I didn't really have any issues with it.
Okay. And they don't provide the exact address, but they do provide some sort of a lat long. You didn't have to geocode it.
No, they are like, it's from ArcGIS Online, the stuff was, so the points inside that were already placed down. So I just was able to use those that were already there.
Yep. And then I'll just throw one more on the maps where you're showing the kernel density and so was there truly more of a higher incidence right on the platform itself? Is that looking at the points?
Yeah, so those were from the area within the points were based off of the points around the platform within that 500-foot buffer. So the intensity that it's showing is based off of just the crime data points that were around the buffers, not the whole city of Minneapolis.
Right. But it's showing a density right on the platform. And then it had a real nice ring effect moving away from the platform in most of the maps that we saw.
I think it's just how it ended up appearing, because it incorporates the platforms, but there's also some of the other platforms were incorporated with it too. So I think it was just based on the intensity of how many crimes were occurring repeatedly in that area. Yep.
And did you try different parameters on the kernel density tool to see what the visualizations would look like?
I used equal intervals first, but I started out with natural for the jinx, I think, which was where it wasn't showing up right or something like that, so I ended up switching to equal intervals was the main reason why.
Yep.
That's just what I ended up setting for it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. So from your data analysis, do you see any trend like the crime rate increase or decrease over the years? So
I think more it's just gonna be more thefts, because it seems like aggravated robbery and stuff like that has dropped throughout since like 2015 to 2017. The crime had already, like aggravated robbery like that had already dropped a little bit. So I think it's just gonna be more like general theft that will maybe increase more.
So Ethan, so 2017 is the recent data.
There is data after 2017 that they have, but they changed the system, which was giving me issues. So that's why I ended up working with the data before they switched to a different system to report their crimes.
Yeah, the reason why I ask you, I'm kind of like interested in the comparison between that 2017 and after, maybe during the pandemic situation,
Yeah.
how that crime is related to this kind of a situation. Or any other question? Audience, you could also maybe ask a question in that chat box, so then we could maybe ask your question to the presenters.
I'll throw another one. Level 1, level 2 crimes. That your data then doesn't include any type of misdemeanors or other arrests. It's only within those. Both of those are serious kind of crimes, right? It's not just you're getting into an argument with somebody on a train platform.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so most of them are pretty severe crimes that I looked at just because I felt like it was more of interest to people than some of the basic thefts. I mean, any theft or any kind of crime is bad, but
yep. And does this change your behavior with going to Twins games or anything? Does this make you feel more or less safe?
It doesn't. I guess it doesn't really change my thought. I think it just makes me more aware of the situation that in the area. So I guess puts me on a little bit higher alert just because I'm aware of it now. So. Yeah.
Okay, so Ethan, thanks for your presentation. So we'll go for our last presenter. So Michael, could you introduce Grace?
Well done, Ethan. Next up is Grace Armon. Armon, But her name is Grace, and she is currently a senior at Macalester College in St. Paul with a major in geography and concentrations in urban studies and community and global health. She is currently interning with the health education department at My Health Clinic for teens and young adults in Hopkins, Minnesota, and has spent the last 3 summers as a counselor at the German Village at Concordia Language Villages. After college, she will be pursuing a master's of public health and eventually work in the public health field. She hopes to continue to use geospatial techniques to examine issues of maternal and child health, place effects on health, or environmental justice. Looks like we're traveling southward down the Mississippi. Welcome, Grace.
Thanks. Okay, I will share my screen here. Okay, let me just scoot a couple things around. Okay, so yeah, I'm Grace. I am currently a senior at Macalester College, and I'm a geography major with a double concentration in urban studies and community and global health. And so today I will be talking about heat and vulnerability in St. Louis, Missouri. And so I did this research with a partner last semester in our Health GIS class, and I wanted to acknowledge her hard work on this project as well. And so we thought this was a very relevant topic to look at as global climate change continues and as summers get a lot hotter. And so one place it gets a lot hotter is in cities. And so we looked specifically at Missouri, at St. Louis, Missouri, but we think this can be applied to a lot of other cities. And so this is actually a story map. And so a lot of this work was done in ArcGIS Online. So it's not projected. I don't like that. But yeah, most of it was in ArcGIS Online. But we did take some of it into ArcPro and into Geoda to do some more analysis. And I can talk more about that as we get going. So to start off, so St. Louis actually had a major heat wave in 1980. It affected all of Missouri, but St. Louis was actually particularly hard hit. And especially in the city of St. Louis, it was older people, non-white people, and lower income people who were particularly hard hit. And this is really not uncommon when it comes to heat waves. And so there has been a lot of research that has gone into that. I will try to keep scrolling to a minimum, but we will see. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about how heat can affect the body. We might think of heat stroke. That might be the most common thing we think of, but you know, it causes like dehydration. It can cause heart problems and things like that. And a lot of the problems arise when there are high temperatures at night, because that is usually the time that the body will like cool down when the temperatures are cooler, or when buildings get a chance to cool down. And so when the temperatures are high at night and high during the day, it becomes a lot more dangerous. And so St. Louis is actually experiencing a lot of extreme heat days already, and that is expected to increase. And again, that's not uncommon with a lot of cities, but it is becoming a lot more severe. And so that is also another thing to keep in mind, just moving forward if we don't, act on climate change. And so I also wanted to touch on the urban heat island effect because it does come into play a little bit here. And so, essentially cities will have more impervious surfaces that will trap a lot more heat as compared to the surrounding countryside. And so this will make cities a lot hotter than the surrounding countryside. And so yeah, St. Louis can be like up to 10 degrees warmer than surrounding areas when it's really, really warm out. But so when we look at the urban heat island effect, it kind of treats the city just as a single unit. And we know that temperature can vary, within a place. Like that is what happens. And that also, when we just look at the city as a singular unit, we're not looking at variation between neighborhoods and maybe how like the built environment can contribute to differences in heat vulnerability. And so redlining and racist lending practices are also part of what has contributed to some of this variation. And so we'll also look into that in this project. So our big question for our research was which areas of St. Louis, Missouri have been made most vulnerable to extreme heat events. And so what we did was we developed our own sort of place-based vulnerability index that we based on the CDC's SVI tool. And so we mapped that for St. Louis here. And so there's a lot more according to the CDC, there's a lot more vulnerability in like the central city, and there's less as you move out to the suburbs. And so we did base our analysis off of this, but we added in a few more of our own variables to account for a lot of those environmental factors, because those really do play a big role in heat vulnerability. So we divided our variables into population variables and then environmental variables. And so we have, first for our population variables, we have the age of population, because older people are often more susceptible to heat-related illness. And so this is the percentage of persons over 65 in a census tract. We did do this at the census tract level also. Then we also looked at people living below the poverty line, because they are more susceptible to heat-related illness as well. And that was also measured by the percentage. And then access to a vehicle. Someone without access to a vehicle may be less able to access a space where it might be cooler. And then we move on to our environmental components of vulnerability. And so we start off with tree cover, which is a big one. You know, if there are more trees, there's going to be more shade. And so it'll be a lot cooler if there are a lot of trees. And then we also have land use. And so highly developed land will have a lot more impervious surfaces or like heat trapping surfaces, and that will cause temperatures to increase. And so we looked at majority land cover in a census tract, with more developed land meaning higher vulnerability. And I'll talk more about how we calculated some of that in a little bit. And we also have age of housing, because older structures are less likely to be built to combat heat. And so we looked at housing built before 1970, because that was actually when a lot of houses were built without central air conditioning. And St. Louis also has a lot of like older brick buildings, and brick also traps a lot of heat. Then we also looked at number of housing units, because structures with more housing units are going to take longer to cool down. And then so we looked at that as percentage of housing structures with 10 or more units per census tract. And then last one, but a really big one, is air quality. And so air pollution can worsen a lot of existing health problems, and it becomes a lot worse when temperatures are high. And so we looked at the census tracts that intersected a 1 mile buffer around all of the major highways in St. Louis. And so they were shown as having higher vulnerability if they did intersect. And then so for canopy cover and land use, we had raster layers. So we had to average them for each census tract. So we took them into ArcPro and used zonal statistics to table, I believe. And so we get this really cool thing where you see like the raster layer here, and then it's averaged for each census tract. And so you can see just the average canopy cover for each census tract. And so what we ended up finding was that, you know, there is a lot higher vulnerability in St. Louis compared to the suburbs. And so we have our map here. Oh, and I should mention that to create our index, we ranked each individual variable and then summed them all together for each census tract. And so actually here's the legend here. And so yes, a lot more vulnerability was concentrated in the city center as compared to the suburbs, but it still looks a little bit different than the CDC SVI index. And so in addition to ranking our census tracts, we also wanted to see how clustered the data was. So we calculated a Moran's eye to measure the spatial autocorrelation of the whole data set. And so we found that the census tracts with similar vulnerabilities were in fact clustered together. And so this map here, we took the data into Geoda to do local indicators of spatial autocorrelation. And so this is the map we got. And so the dark red areas, as you'll see, so these are census tracts. If a census tract is dark red, it is an area of high vulnerability clustered in an area of high vulnerability. And for the dark blue census tracts, that would be a census tract that has low vulnerability clustered in a greater area of low vulnerability. And then we also have the light blue and light red. And so light blue would be an area of low vulnerability clustered within an area of higher vulnerability. And then a light red census tract would be an area of higher vulnerability clustered within an area of lower vulnerability. And then the gray area is where it is not statistically significant. And so we can also look, well, so we have our maps, which are great. We can also look right at, you know, some aerial shots to kind of give us like more of a picture into what some of these places might look like. And so to start off, we have a census tract that falls within our lowest vulnerability classification. It is in the suburbs. The population is, younger. There's a lower poverty rate. A lot of people own vehicles. There's about 35% canopy cover. About half the housing was built before 1970. And it is actually located within 1 mile of a highway, but it is in the lowest vulnerability classification. So that's what it looks like on the ground. And then we can look at another area of higher vulnerability. And so this tract is within the city proper, and its vulnerability score is within the highest classification. And so this tract also has a younger population, but the poverty rate is significantly higher. Population without a vehicle is also relatively high. There's a lot less tree cover. And a lot of the housing was built before 1970, and there are more housing structures with 10 plus units, still not very many, but they are also located within 1 mile of the highway. And so they have a much higher, this tract has a much higher vulnerability score. And so it's also hard to talk about extreme heat without also talking about redlining, because redlining has definitely contributed to a lot of the disparities that we see within cities. And so, a lot of studies say, they note that non-white individuals are disproportionately affected by higher temperatures, but a lot of this hasn't really been contributed to environmental characteristics, much of which have been shaped by redlining and racial segregation. And so if you're familiar with redlining maps, a lot of when the HOLC made these maps with the New Deal, they marked desirable areas to invest. Those are marked in green, and then really, really undesirable areas or areas with any Black population whatsoever were marked in red. And so they were considered like dangerous places. People should not invest there. And so a lot of these neighborhoods are really still experiencing a lot of disinvestment, a lot of lack of social cohesion, and then also higher temperatures because of this. So yeah, and then so we also have a redlining map here that we've compared to our vulnerability index map. And so you can kind of slide back and forth. It's a little difficult to see because they don't, they overlap a little too well, I think. But if you look like in the city center, you can definitely see there's a lot of red spots. And then there's further green spots as you move out to the suburbs. And the other thing is a lot of parts of the inner city were cleared to quote unquote reduce urban blight and redevelop urban areas and build highways and things like that. And then highways will also contribute to more air pollution and higher temperatures. And so that's affecting the people who might still live around the highways.
Just a 3-minute warning there.
Oh, thank you. And so St. Louis also has a really interesting history with public housing and development that way. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Pruitt-Igoe development. It's a very famous development that was opened in the 1950s. There's a picture of it there, very different from the buildings around it, as you can see also. And so public housing was already very underfunded, but the Korean War actually diverted a lot of the funds that were supposed to go towards public housing. And so Pruitt-Igoe was built using a lot of cheap materials, and stuff often stopped working and was never really fixed. And so the housing was actually still segregated. And so the Pruitt half had Black residents and the Igoe half had white residents. And then with desegregation, Pruitt-Igoe actually lost a lot of its occupancy to white flight. And so by the 70s, the development was only at 31% occupancy. So this meant that there were a lot fewer funds to actually pay for building maintenance. And so it was often associated with poverty and violence that outsiders assumed was the residents' fault, despite the fact that the government let it fall into disrepair. And so Pruitt-Igoe was actually demolished in the 1970s. And so where it stood is actually still empty. And I'll skip through this, but there are some cities who are, working on some of these social vulnerability efforts that I've linked here. And so in conclusion, it's really important that a lot of our climate change adaptation should be occurring in cities, and especially with neighborhoods that have been made a lot more vulnerable to heat-related events, like the ones I've highlighted in St. Louis, but it's true for cities like all over the place too. And so it also means we have to, come to terms and fix these systemic issues like redlining and racial segregation if we want to combat climate change. So that is all I have. Thank you very much, and I will stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Grace. So we'll take the questions.
I can ask a few questions. So is this an individual project or a group project? Because you mentioned that we a lot of times. So
Yes, I did. I had a partner in this project, but yes, I was just the one who presented it. But yes, we both worked on it.
so, but you are the leader of this project, right?
Well, we both worked on it together, but I volunteered to present.
Okay. So why you use Geoda instead of ArcGIS Pro for the NISA analysis?
That was mostly because as part of the Health GIS class, we learned how to use the LISA cluster analysis, but the professor taught us how to use it in Geoda, and so I never actually learned how to use it in ArcGIS Pro.
Okay.
And I actually found it pretty easy to use in Geoda. So.
Okay.
I just have a couple of questions. Maybe you covered this and I missed it, but why St. Louis?
Oh, yeah. So when we first started working on this project, we knew we wanted to look at a city that was very segregated because we knew the disparities would be greater. And so St. Louis is a very segregated city. Also, I have family that used to live there, and visiting there in the summers, I was like, it's really hot here. And so I was interested in, how those combined. And also, I feel like when looking at big cities and climate change, things like this, I feel like St. Louis is often left out. And so I was really interested to see what conditions were really like there.
Okay, thank you. And I just have a couple of questions about some of your assumptions and where you got your data layers from. For example, access to vehicle, where did you get that?
Oh, yes, sorry, I also forgot to mention that. That was from the census. And that was, oh, sorry.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I think it was vehicle ownership, I believe. So not quite access to a vehicle, but yeah.
Okay, so that was the one assumption. Another one is you equate air quality with proximity to roads. I think you used a 1 mile buffer. Why did you use that as a metric for air quality?
Yeah, that was also one of the, like you said, that was another kind of assumption that we made. Well, because we knew air pollution would, play a role in how vulnerable a neighborhood was to heat. But that highways were one of the few ways we really were able to find data on air pollution, because there is the toxic release inventory, but that's not always updated, or they might not have the most accurate information for that. And so we went with highways just because we figured there's likely to be a lot of cars on the highway creating pollution. And so at the time that seemed kind of the best metric that we could come up with for air pollution.
How heavily did it weigh? Did you, when you summed this up to get your index, was that equally, were each of these equally weighted, or did you give more weight to one than another?
I think they all ended up being equally weighted. I don't know if that was our original plan. So it was a little difficult to decide some of these. I think the one that ended up being a little differently weighted was land use, because the raster file that we found said that there was high intensity, medium intensity, low intensity, and then open space, and then there's a whole other separate category for forests. And so that one ended up being weighted a little differently, but I think the rest of them were actually pretty equally weighted.
Thank you.
Couple of questions, thanks. Grace, great presentation. Yeah, I was going to ask about weighting as well. And you said that you ended up weighting them equally. Did you had thoughts that they should be differently weighted, some of your variables?
Yeah, that was kind of an issue because, well, it's also interesting because some of the variables like compounded in a really interesting way, because like both of the neighborhoods that we showed as examples for like conditions on the ground, like neither of them had super old populations, but one of them ended up being like a lot more vulnerable. And so we weren't really sure, you know, if we should weight age more, or if or even if just the environmental factors should have been given more weight compared to like the population ones. And so it was really just a lot of back and forth on that. We also debated whether or not we should put race in as a variable, but we decided that since it's not actually, you know, people are not biologically like more like susceptible to heat related illness, that it was not worth it to put in. So yeah, it just ended up being, we had a lot of conversations about how we should divide it up, but yeah.
And then just one technical question. Right at the beginning of your talk, you said that I think you said you didn't like the fact that it's not projected, or that it's maybe referring that it's using a Web Mercator projection. Why don't you like that in this particular case?
Well, I don't think it necessarily like messes with the function of the map at all. I mean, just based on like the location of Lewis, but it just doesn't look as nice in my opinion. And I know that's kind of a, maybe not a great answer, but that's kind of how ArcGIS Online makes me feel.
Yeah. Good, thank you.
I do have one more question. So when you showed us the 2 example neighborhoods, especially the second one, because I noticed the image, the aerial image looks very green. However, in your, you know, the text you mentioned, there's only like 7.2% of the canopy cover, and you know, and that's a very susceptible neighborhood. But when I look at the image, it looks so green. So, did you include the urban grass in your consideration, or just the tree canopy?
Yeah, so that was another kind of thing we had to consider, because so we just included the like canopy cover, but then we also wanted to look for well, we were thinking of looking at green space and impervious surfaces, and we were not able to find, it's easier to find green space, but we didn't end up using anything like that. So we tried to do impervious surfaces instead, and there's really no shape files that are just, you know, impervious surfaces within a city. I mean, maybe there were out there, but we were not able to find one. And so that's why we went to land use instead, because we figured that highly developed land would have a lot more like parking lots, or yeah, parking lots is what comes to mind. No, but I think it would have been worthwhile to look into just more green space in general.
Yeah.
Any
As
other questions?
I was going to say, as an afterthought, I thought it would be interesting. I think you mentioned it, but I didn't see it there. And that would be the SVI side by side with your analysis, or even a swipe. But it would have been interesting to see them side by side.
Yeah, I agree.
How long did it take to put the story map together? There's a lot of work in that.
I want to say the entire month of April. Maybe, well, the research itself maybe a little bit longer, and then the story map altogether probably took us a good 2.5 weeks to get everything in there that we had from like other programs, and then all of our information too. So yeah.
Okay. So, Grace, you know, maybe if you want to polish your project someday, you could consider regression model, factor analysis, correlation, you know, metrics, GWR, whatsoever. But I'm kind of into like see your method to the other city. Like I studied my PhD in Georgia, so maybe the Georgia we have a lot of segregation. So how like your method impact to the other city. Other than that, everybody did a good job. So I think maybe we need to wrap it up our section. So first of all, thanks for our presenters. You guys did a very excellent job. And then thanks for our judges to ask a lot of challenge question too. No? That is a part of our life. And then thanks for our audience, to join and support the graduate competition. I hopefully to see the judges to today's at 4 to finalize our winners. So do you have any question or concern? Okay, then please enjoy the rest of the day, and I hope like we could still enjoy the sunshine, until the winter has come. So
Just
have a,
see you
job,
at 4.
students. Good job.
okay,
Thank
have a
you.
good day. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.